uh, Conceptions of Divinity in African and Afro-Brazilian Religions. I'm Dr. José Eduardo Porcher, Assistant Professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, and I'll be your chair for this event. This is the third meeting in a series on underrepresented religious traditions, following earlier sessions in October and December 2025, and continuing through February and April 2026. The series forms a part of the project Concepts of God and the Variety of Theisms in Indian Traditions, led by Professor Ricardo Silvestre, funded by the John Templeton Foundation, and managed by the Brazilian Association for Philosophy of Religion. Today's event is organized in cooperation with the Association for Logic and Religion as part of its monthly webinar series. And this roundtable is also a collaboration with the project Spiritual Realities, Relationality, and Flourishing Brazilian Contributions to Philosophy of Religion, led by myself and by Dr. Marciano Spica, funded by the John Templeton Foundation through the Global Philosophy of Religion Project 2 at the University of Birmingham. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Emmanuel Ofuasia, Professor Bettina Schmidt, and Professor Stephen Engler. Let me briefly outline the format. Each speaker will give a short presentation of about 20 to 30 minutes, and after the three presentations, we will open the floor for questions. You are very welcome to submit questions in the chat, and I will relay them as far as possible. Please, please, please keep your microphones muted during the presentations. If you would like to ask a question orally, you may use the raise hand function, and I will invite you to speak if that's possible. With that, let me now turn to a brief introduction of our first guest, Dr. Emmanuel Ofuasia. Emmanuel is a research associate in the philosophy department at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and he has also taught at the National Open University of Nigeria in Abuja. He specializes in process metaphysics and philosophical logic, as well as their intersections with African philosophy of religion and Ifa studies. It is safe to say that he is one of the foremost philosophers working in Yoruba religion today. His most recent books from 2026, both of them, are Panentheism and Concepts of God in African Traditional Religions, out from Springer, and an exploration of the parallels between African and process metaphysics, out from Palgrave Macmillan. So with that, I give the floor to you, Emmanuel, and thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, thank you very much, José, for inviting me. I hope you can hear me. All right, thank you very much. I can go ahead now. It's a privilege to be with everybody here this afternoon. I have read Bettina Schmidt. I've also read Steve Engler copiously. I've cited them in my work, so it's a privilege to be here. So I thank the Brazilian Association for Philosophy of Religion for considering me for this talk. And so before I proceed, I'd like to share my screen and get the ground rolling. I hope you can see my screen. All right. So the title of my talk today is Divinity and the Turn to Panentheism in African Philosophy of Religion. Today, I will be presenting myself as an emissary of African philosophy of religion, and also stating how much I have helped to shape the discipline in the last couple of years. And an overview of what I'll be talking about within the next 10, 20, 15 to 25 minutes is laid before you. One of the first points that may be noticed in African philosophy of religion is that in recent times, scholarship is beginning to turn to panentheism as a more adequate or appropriate concept for talking about the relationship that the divinity has with the world and the people in it. This is followed by conceptual clarification. Ideological considerations are shown to establish why monotheism is inappropriate or flawed for referring to the African God in relation to how this God uh, engages with the world. And most of these scholars cite the fact that the nature of God in African spirituality makes it impossible to pin that divinity to monotheism. Even though the impact of monotheism cannot be overruled, but the shift is beginning to, gather the relevant attention. So as a result of that, I move to talk about some works that have explored panentheism in African philosophy of religion. There are about 3 or 4 scholars that are working in that area to justify why panentheism is the most appropriate concept. If it were any other discipline, of course, I would have finished making my presentation by now, but because as philosophers, we cherish the idea of using a gallon of words to explain a spoonful of thoughts. And the spoonful of thoughts are usually the conclusion, and the premises have to come to justify these conclusions that I lay before you. So without much ado, the first question that I will want to consider in this talk is what kind of theism suits divinity in African spirituality? Of course, these births an exercise in conceptual clarification. We can talk about agnosticism. Agnosticism is the suspension of the possibility of a divine being. This is not a concept that is appropriate in African belief system. Atheism, the belief or denial that the denial in the existence of divinity is almost non-existent in African spirituality. And now this leads us to theism. Theism is the belief in God or gods. And so there are various shades of theism as I have laid before you. Now, what marks polytheism away from these other shades of theism is that polytheism maintains the belief in numerous gods. Pantheism maintains that God and the world, they are identical. Monotheism, the belief in one God. Panentheism is the belief in one God that is in the world. Henotheism talks about the outlook of taking one God as overriding other available gods. And deism, which is very synonymous with the worldview of Aristotle, maintains that God would have created the world and then retreated and does not want to have any kind of relationship with the world. They highlighted that you can see on your screen that I'm highlighting at the moment has one particular feature which has usually been overlooked in scholarship, and that is each of them, the highlighted, talk about just one God. Now, after African religion was denied, was doubted, was casted as idolatry, as paganism, for most African scholars like Bolaji Dowu, John Mbiti, John Dankwa, John Awolalu, a lot of them, mostly there were clergymen, Methodist, Anglican, who wanted to ground the gospel, and they wanted to use African religion and spirituality as that vehicle. So they brought the fact that African traditional religion is not polytheistic. It is also not fetishism, as scholars like Baker and others have mentioned. And so they said it is a version of monotheism that can be called modified monotheism. So they try to modify the monotheism to suit their aim. Now, Bolaji Dowu talks about diffused monotheism. And by diffused monotheism, in chemistry, diffusion says the movement of molecules from the region of higher concentration to region of lower concentration. So in this case, the region of higher concentration is a supreme being, and it is from the supreme being that power flows downwards. And that is the kind of monotheism offered by Bolaji Dowu. The renowned Mbiti considered African religion and spirituality as preparatio evangelica. By preparatio evangelica, it means that it is through African spirituality that the gospel can thrive. So he saw African spirituality and religion as a means through which the gospel can be propagated on the African soil. Although a lot of scholars have tried to debunk their ideas that they went too far to misrepresent African spirituality, but recently, Mosamai Molefe and Tad Metz brought another kind of argument that portrayed African spirituality as a neglected monotheism. In previous works, I have tried to question this assumption that what do you mean by it is neglected? Who is responsible for the neglect? And the implication is that African spiritualities are the peripheral, and it can only be admitted into scholarship by those who neglected it. And of course, by neglect, it is the global north. But with all of this being said, we cannot wish away the fact that a careful consideration of the deity in African spirituality shows that the effort to use monotheism to talk about divinity is really, really questionable. Before going into that, I would like to bring us to the fact that the ultimate tussle is usually the tussle that has to do with the Abrahamic monotheisms. And the Abrahamic monotheisms are the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions versus the non-Abrahamic monotheisms. These are the other versions of the monotheism. Pantheism is one God. Panentheism is one God. Deism is one God. But the challenge has been that these other versions of the one God, the monogod, do not conform to the subaltern. These other forms of one God beliefs are subaltern, and the subaltern is the Abrahamic monotheism. And that is why, the question of, this is where the question of paganism comes into the picture. Because according to the lexicon dictionary of the English language, paganism is the belief or practice of a religion that is not accepted or does not worship the gods of the Jews, the Christians, and Muslims. So technically, all other versions of monotheism have been branded as paganism in most scholarship. Having said this, it is now important for us to turn to the nature of deity in African spirituality in order to appreciate what kind of God and what kind of attributes are extended to this divine entity. In African scholarship, there's a general belief that the God is limited. And by this, the argument is that the superlative attributes of being good, being wise, being powerful are not applicable to the African God, because the African God can lie. The African God does not know, can forget. The African God relies on the subordinates, the divinities, over some important issues. And these are documented in our oral traditions. And another feature of this higher God in African spirituality is that it is relational. The God does not relate directly with humans, but does this through the mediators who are the divinities. Another important feature is the notion that God is co-creator, and the co-creative power of God is established in the various narratives and stories concerning creation, where God brought the world into being through existing matter. And this notion of bringing things from previously existing things is not actually something new. If you go as far back as the ancient Egyptian times, well, Nun, for instance, is considered as that primordial ground from where Ra-Atum, that is God in ancient Kemite philosophy, arose. So it was from the primeval matter, Nun, N-U-N, that Ra-Atum, God, arose, and then all other things, the deities and the opposites of forces arose. And so virtually all the narratives concerning the nature of God in African spirituality affirm that God is a co-creator with the divinities and God brought the world into being ex materia. When this is compared with the creatio ex nihilo that is very, very predominant among the Anselmian notion of divinity, which is very popular in the global north. It is clear that the monotheism in that religious culture cannot apply to deity in Africa. Another important issue is the transcendence immanence, and this is one central feature in panentheism. God is transcendent in the way that it does not relate directly with humans and the world, but through divinities. Nevertheless, the immanent character is exhibited because most of the actions and effects actually reflect back to God. Another feature is that of hiddenness and silence. The fact that God is hidden and cannot be encountered directly would have been grounds for denying the existence of God in the Anglo-American philosophic tradition. But in Africa, this is a very, very strong reason why we believe in God, because the absence of evidence is not an evidence of absence. With these few ascriptions to why the nature of God does not suit the monotheistic portrayal, there are now about 5 works in the history of African philosophy of religion that I will briefly gloss through. The first work that would argue for a panentheistic framework for African philosophy of religion is Ofuasia's work, Monotheism and Metaphysics in Yoruba Thought System. Another that came through is that of the Chimakunams, where they examine the logical problem of evil and tender that the nature of God in African spirituality and religion is panentheistic. The same with my book in 2024. Another publication is that of Luis Cordero, Rodriguez, and Adagada that appeared in 2024. They also affirmed. And then my book, which take cognizance of these other previous publications and reiterate the fact that African spirituality is better guided. Now, in spite of all of these turn to panentheism in African philosophy of religion, I find the nature of the African God offered by other scholars problematic. Now, the Chimakunams offer the harmony God thesis. At least that is how they describe God in their work. And they find out that the harmony God is probably best supported by panentheism. And this is because of the fact that there is a relational character between God and the world. While their effort is worthy of consideration, I find 3 objections against such an expression. While I do not begrudge them that African spirituality can be captured by panentheism, I feel that that paper that they wrote was not actually about making a case for panentheism. Their paper was actually about using an Afro-inspired logic system to show that the logical problem of evil does not apply to African spirituality. So this is just a by the way claim that they make. It wasn't the central character of their work, unlike my own arguments. They do not also offer a metaphysical foundation for their claims. In addition to this, both before this publication and after this publication, the Chimakunams have not taken and explored further the panentheistic implications in the harmony God thesis. And the last is that they didn't use any Afro-religious culture to curate their panentheistic view. So it is not so sure if they have any textual evidence, oral tradition, or any African spiritual practices that they have used to establish the harmony God thesis. Another work of similar standard is that for Luis Cordero Rodriguez and Agada. In their article, they're articulating a view where the limited God thesis in African philosophy of religion does not possess the superlatives of power, knowledge, and benevolence. In spite of this, that does not make the God a lesser God, they argued. Now, in the course of making their case, they also claim to be introducing panentheism to African philosophy of religion. So the introduction question is questionable in itself because they didn't consult previous publications on the subject. And then throughout the work, they offer a masculine portrayal of the African higher God. When we establish in African philosophy of religion that God cannot be worshipped directly except through the divinities, no one has seen God, it is miraculous to find Adagada and Cordero Rodriguez referring to God as a he. But then a careful analysis shows that this is a semantic and assumed outlook that God should be a he and could not have been a she or an it. Another flaw, which is similar to that which I pointed out with the Chimaku names, also suffices here, because throughout their work, Cordero Rodriguez and Agada did not offer any religious culture that is Afro-inspiring, that has oral evidence to validate what they are arguing about. And so enters the Iwa God offered by Ofuasia. The Iwa God is the kind of God that is a blend of Ra-Atum in ancient Egyptian cosmology and Olodumare in the Yoruba culture that has also been exported to Brazil and some other parts of the Americas. And unlike the previous efforts that have tried to signal panentheism to African philosophy of religion, my study is deeply involved in field research funded and collaboration with practitioners in the field, engagement with oral tradition. And so through this, I am able to offer an improved version of this panentheistic God by giving evidences. For instance, the notion of a limited God thesis in Olodumare has been validated in other studies before mine, but one of the facts is that most studies that try to do this are shying away from using oral tradition. For instance, as an evidence to the fact that the limited God thesis is actually reinforced by oral tradition, there is a verse from Odoye Kumeji, which says in Yoruba, Ìgbàgbé ṣi Olódùmarè, ó gbàgbé láti la ẹsẹ̀ pẹ́pẹ́yẹ. And in a rough transliteration of what I just said in Yoruba, it says that it was Olodumare's forgetfulness that accounts for the non-separation of the dog's feet. This is an instance of the kind of God that can forget. You know, previous scholarship that have tried to explain this notion of God just gloss over that, okay, this God does not have these superlative attributes, but they are hesitant to establish, give evidence from oral tradition, give evidence from those who are practitioners in the field, and they have been hesitant about that. Similarly, when you take a look at the fact that God does not have superlative power, superlative knowledge, this is also evidence in another verse from Odoye Kumeji as well, where the persuasive and relational character of God are clearly established about someone who had reported Olodumare, Oromila to Olodumare. And because Olodumare would not want to give judgment without considering both parties, Olodumare had to summon Oromila for Oromila's side of the story to become clear. And then it was only afterwards that Olodumare established judgments and was happy that he had not given judgment in the absence of evidence. Now, this is in contrast with the Abrahamic God that knows everything. Various portions of Psalm says that this God knows us even from our mother's womb when we were forming. And so that is a fatalistic life in a way. But when you take a look at the persuasive and relational God of the Yoruba as documented in the Odoye Kumeji, it is very clear that the relational and persuasive nature of God are justified. Where does all of this lead us? This leads us to consider once again the principal character of African panentheism. As I've said before, panentheism approximates the features of God in 80 R's as immanent, persuasive, limited, imperfect, and a co-creator God that does the creation through ex materia. And panentheism itself is the outlook that the higher God includes the world in its being. And at the same time, the higher God is more than the events in the world. What this means is that this independent entity, God, is an individual with unique aims. This God resides in this world. This God can be affected and is affected by things in the world, just like the things in the world are affected by this God as well. And it's on this basis that I make the case that the African God does not share all the attributes that have been laid at various versions and shades of modified monotheisms. In my book that was published last month, I have tried to use not just the Yoruba culture, about 6 other religious cultures across Africa to validate my position that African philosophy of religion, when talking about the nature of divinity, should consider strongly panentheism as an alternative. Now, a critic may object that I have tried to praise myself here and I've not tried to show how my work has also been criticized after also criticizing others. Yes, I'm aware that there are some works that I've also criticized my work. For instance, there is a work from Sherif BME that has criticized my panentheism in African philosophy of religion as questionable, and he is offering that it is deistic, actually. So these are also works that I've tried to build on mine, revise my work, and cost me more reasons to go back and reflect. Having said all of this, I will now bring my talk to an end and hope that I can be corrected where I have reasoned wrongly as we move on. Thank you very much, Jose.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. I see that Evan Fails is raising his hand, but Evan, if you could, please wait until the Q&A session. I'll try to remember that you were the first one to raise your hand, and we'll just go straight into the second talk now by Bettina Schmidt, and then we'll come back after Stephen Engler's talk to a Q&A session that should be around 30 minutes. So thanks so much, Emmanuel, again for your fascinating talk. You're the stalwart of panentheism in African religions, and I'm really excited to hear from our audience what they have to say about your ideas. But before that, let's go into Bettina's talk. Bettina, our second guest for this roundtable, is professor in the study of religions and anthropology of religion at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. And she's also the director of the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Center. Her research focuses on Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Brazilian religions, spirit possession and mediumship, as well as contemporary spirituality and migration. Her work combines ethnographic research with theoretical reflection on ritual, embodiment, and religious experience across the African diaspora. And she's the author of Spirits and Trance in Brazil, an anthropology of religious experience, out on Bloomsbury in 2016, and the co-editor of Spirituality and Well-Being, Interdisciplinary Approaches to the Study of Religious Experience and Health, out on Equinox in 2020. So without further ado, thank you for joining us, Bettina. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, José, and thank you, Emmanuel, for this excellent start of our panel. It was really interesting to hear your arguments upon panentheism, and I will look out for your book and put it on the reading list for my students next year. So this is great. So I will now try to share my desktop. with I think this is my PowerPoint. And going back here. So, can you see it?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I'm more used with Teams and not Zoom, and this is why I'm always a bit I want to double check where everything is there. So thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to a panel about divinity in African and Afro-Brazilian religions. I must admit, when I got the email from José, I was a little bit reluctant because I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a theologian or philosopher. But as he persuaded me some years ago to come to Brazil for a panel in the Brazilian Philosophy of Religion conference, he also persuaded me to join you here with my ideas about mainly candomblé, and so I will speak mainly about Brazilian religion. As José already mentioned, this was my last monograph. Oh, it's now nearly 10 years ago. I'm quite ashamed that I have not written a monograph since then. However, I edited a couple of volumes and was publishing and contributed to other books. However, this book on anthropology of religious experience was for me quite a good way to get more into the thinking about concepts in religious practice, because as an anthropologist, I mainly look into the practical part. And so I'm, as I mentioned, not a philosopher, nor a theologian, though sometimes I'm labeled as such, but an anthropologist. So my starting point is always similar also to what Emmanuel argued. My starting point is always my information I gathered from conversation with participants, with their views, their stories, their narratives. My study, therefore, reflects their worldview and ideas, their practices. The term philosophy is quite a Western, perhaps even Eurocentric term, with philosophy of religion preoccupied, as Michael Burley states, with a narrow range of questions concerning an ahistoric and decontextualized theism. And so its fixation on a homogeneous theism does not represent the messy and contradictory ideas anthropologists collect in the field. Traditionally, anthropologists emphasize the importance of practice rather than belief, as for instance, our British hero, even Welsh roots, Edward Evans Pritchard, mentioned decades ago for anthropology of religion. More recently, the focus had shifted more in the study of religion also to practice, for instance, in Manuel Vasquez's book, More Than Belief. Another borderline is between theology and anthropology of religion. While I'm the professor in study of religion in my university, I always tell my students I'm not a theologian. And to be honest, I'm also not so much interested in what God is, but what people think about God. And of course, the practice. And so in line with Michael Lembeck, I'm challenging the conceptualization of God as singular, unitary, and supreme, often perceived as male patriarch. By engaging with candomblé worldviews and practice, we gain, I argue, an understanding that religion, and consequently also divinity, is more than God within the Abrahamic religion. So you see, I follow Emmanuel's footsteps. While followers of Abrahamic tradition believe that only they can access the truth, candomblé practitioners have a much more heterogeneous understanding rooted within the practice. Consequently, anthropologists have always struggled with philosophy and theology, even avoided using the term. But this focus does not mean that people we we are speaking with do not have big ideas and thoughts about the world, the divine, and our place in the cosmos. And anthropologists also have made contribution to the way we think about the world. In my presentation today, therefore, I followed Tim Ingold's position, who claims that anthropology is philosophy with people in it. More recently, he described anthropology as a philosophical inquiry into the conditions and possibility of life in one world we all inhabit. To some degree, it is in line with a new shift among philosophers of religion who have argued against their narrow understanding of philosophy. For instance, Timothy Nepper point out that if one wants to philosophize about religion, then one needs to understand religion in all its messy cultural historical diversity. And this, of course, is the link to the messy anthropologists. Consequently, I will speak today about the ideas people discuss within Candomblé, which is the foundation of their beliefs and practice. And at the core of their worldview is Axé. And here on my slides, I use the Brazilian spelling of Axé, not the Yoruba and not the American or the Cuban one. So just to clarify, this is why Axé is with an X. The concept of Axé is difficult. Similar to the concept of soul in Christianity, it is embedded in a religious context and cannot be separated from it. I came across the word Axé, though within the English spelling Axé, A-S-H-E, the first time in 92, when I was in Puerto Rico for my PhD research on the Cuban religion Santeria and Puerto Rican Espiritismo. As the focus of my PhD was on identity, I didn't discuss the theological core of the belief, but focused in my conversation on impact, belonging, practices. I must have encountered the term Axé in my reading, but didn't grasp its importance until I came across the Puerto Rican artist Angel Suarez Rosado, whose art featured in an exhibition La Tercera Raíz in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which I was able to see. I became fascinated by his bricolage, so visible on the altars he created. And in the catalogue of the exhibition, sites of recollections for altars and a rap opera, which was organized by the Museum of Art in Williamstown, Massachusetts, he defined Axé as creative energy, without which he would be unable to create. And so this is a quote from an interview he gave for this catalogue about when the gods give us the power of Axé. And so it is, Axé is in everything, the stones, the feathers. And so it fascinated me, and I got in contact with him and asked whether I could use a photo also in my PhD, which he kindly agreed to. But back to Brazil, my second home, my passion now. And so similar to what the artist described, the Puerto Rican artist, Axé in Brazil is also connects everyone in the universe and is not restricted to human beings, but part of every being, living as well as supernatural. Without Axé, nothing would exist. But like matter, Axé can neither be created nor destroyed. Nivaldo Leonetto and his co-authors even describe Axé as a mystic force that is present in some places, objects or certain parts of the animal body, such as heart, liver, lungs, and so on, but also in stone, in seeds, and fruit. All living beings receive Axé by birth, but the amount in the body fluctuates during one's life. We constantly spend it, but it can also be regenerated, for instance, by attending ceremonies in honor of the orishas. Sometimes the orishas are perceived as personification of Axé. However, more often it is linked to the creation, in particular to Olodumare, who can be described as a supreme god, or he's often described as supreme god that breathed life into the physical shape created by Oxalá. Without Olodumare, there would be no Ashe, no living beings. Following on in the concept, oops, I forgot to click on my slides, and so I'm here now on this slide, Ashe. Following on the concept of Ashe, I want to reflect about Ashe, about potentially a feature of divinity, the topic of today's panel. Candomblé worldview has an integrated cosmology that links the human world and the world of the Orishas. And as the core of this link is Ashe. Humans have to maintain the right balance of Ashe because having too little or too much Ashe can cause physical, mental, or social problems. Ashe can be regenerated by fulfilling obligations to the Orisha, which Seligman, for instance, calls spiritual investment. Sacrifice are vehicles for the transmission of Ashe between God and humans. Hence, though the Orishas are usually regarded as deities, though not in the Abrahamic sense of a supreme being, they all have Ashe, the divine energy. At this point, I will go back to Michael Lambeck's critique of the Western concept of God and religion. Lambeck challenges the Abrahamic view of God, who intervenes in history, who extracts promises, who remembers, he keeps his contracts and demands and expects the same of his worshippers. And so this was all a quote from Lambeck's chapter. Hence, Lambeck argues that this conceptualization is not universal. Instead, he sees God as substantial and as insubstantial, as specific and as non-specific, as, for instance, the term home. He locates deity in local, particular, contextually dependent manifestations, rather than in grand, reified, and personalized abstraction. And so it's concrete, specific, not an abstract concept. And here I come to the conclusion of my short presentation. My aim today was to show that putting Ashe at the cornerstone of Candomblé enables an understanding of what matters to the practitioner, which is at the heart of anthropology. Candomblé is often described as worship of the Orishas, even an embodied practice. Roberto Motta, for instance, describes Candomblé and the other African-derived traditions in Brazil as religion of the body. And Mark Münzel compares the ritualistic embodiment of the Orishas in trance with the performance of a horse guided by the rider through elegant and difficult figures, physical, and therefore physical quality. However, I want to highlight a different topic, a different point here. Ethnography is often accused of being anti-philosophical, anti-theoretical, the strong focus on practice and ethnographic description rather than theoretical reflection. However, I disagree with this criticism. This is very generalizing and misleading. Anthropologists have made numerous contributions to the way we perceive the world. I just want to mention here, as most of the audience is Brazil, or Eduardo de Castro, or North America, Irvin Hallowell, whose theoretical ideas and discourses are grounded in ethnographic research. But ethnographic insights are not just illustration, but a way to challenge preconceived conceptions. And I must admit also colonial way to look at the world. We have to overcome this period of our history. By doing this, my approach to Candomblé has shifted and has become less focused on the practice and more on ideas. Consequently, it has shown that while Orishas are important as the core divine agencies and means to revive Ashe, they are also means to an end. It is Ashe that links humans and other than human beings. Consequently, Candomblé is more than a belief, a system of beliefs and practice. Though Candomblé is indeed a religion of the body with a strong experiential dimension, it also provides a sophisticated way of seeing the world within a material, spiritual dimension. Ashe is the cornerstone of this worldview. It is the energy that binds the body with the immaterial spiritual dimension of our existence, which cannot be conceived without an understanding of Ashe. While I am an anthropologist and am inspired by what I see and observe, and usually not what people think, Ashe has captured my interest, and perhaps because it is so different from our European ways of seeing the world. So thank you for listening, and here is my contact details and my email. I'm always happy to hear from people. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bettina, for that wonderful talk. And so far, Bettina and Emmanuel gave very compact presentations, so we're very good on time, which is great news because we'll have more than enough time for Q&A after the next talk by our third guest, Stephen Engler. Stephen, are you there?
Yes,
Stephen
I am.
Engler is professor of religious studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Canada, where I hear it's very chilly now.
Feels
And
like minus 30 out there.
yeah, pretty much the opposite of Porto Alegre, where I am, which is about 30 degrees Celsius now. Um, So Stephen's work focuses, as Bettina's does, on Afro-Brazilian religions and spirit incorporation practices and the theory and methods of the study of religion. His research is both ethnographic and conceptual. He does a lot of methodological reflection, including work on lived religion, esotericism, and how philosophical semantics bears on the study of religions. He's the author of the recent book Tradition, a Critical Primer, out on Equinox in 2024, and the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Research Methods in the Study of Religion, now in its second edition, amongst other publications. So without much ado, thanks so much, Stephen, for agreeing to do this. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers, the funders, and thanks to Emmanuel and Bettina for great presentations, very thoughtful and important in the issues we're talking about. So let me share my desktop and scoot over to the PowerPoint. So you should be seeing that. So I'm interested in the issue of not how my ethnography fits into philosophy, but how philosophy can shape ethnography. I spent a lot of time sitting, waiting to talk to spirits in terreiros and centros of Umbanda. And in that time, I look at the people who are incorporating spirits and the people talking to the spirits incorporated in the mediums. And then I go and have my turn. And I think, as an ethnographer or a scholar of religion, does it really even matter to me whether these entities actually exist? And I think, how does it matter to the people in this room that these entities actually exist? And that has, over 20 years of field work now, led me to the view that existence, when it drags philosophical ideas with it, gets in the way. And the quote that Bettina just showed of Michael Lambeck kind of gets the point. The presence of divinities, entities, deities in the rituals is a separate issue. Concepts bring presuppositions with them. If we talk about gods, well, let's throw that out. But even divinity presumes a human divine distinction, which is going to look different in some contexts than others. We have to be careful we don't drag monotheistic assumptions with us. The distinction between natural and supernatural is going to play out differently in different contexts, and we can't bring an assumption of a sharp binary into the context. I'm going to work with the word entity because I think people have spent less time thinking about the problematic presuppositions that questions of existing and not existing bring to the field. So here's a Umbanda altar. Do these entities exist? Well, what are we talking about? There's one of the haunting ideas. If we look at a statue, supposedly it refers to an entity, but when that entity incorporates, is that the same entity, or is this a type of entity? And the entity I'm talking to a more specific sub-token of the type. And what's this picture of a little girl? Well, it turns out that that's the niece of the Pai de Santo, and it's here for sort of blessing purposes. But the referent to the picture's the little girl, but that doesn't help us understand anything. You have to talk about the context. Why is it here? What's the purpose? So it gets confusing. Here's a quote from fieldwork in Minas Gerais. Our little Yorkie thinks that even though it's -30, there might be a bird out there. So what's the religion here? This terreiro has 3 different religions on different days of the week: Quimbanda, Umbanda, Candomblé. And sometimes the same entity is part of the different religions. So if we're talking about what these words regarding the entities refer to, it's kind of hard to say. Do they refer to the same thing in different religions or different things in different religions? What does religion even mean when one group of people with one leader in one space, sometimes slightly separated spaces, but separated more in time, are all doing 3 different things? Our categories start to fracture. So let's throw out the categories and start thinking more pragmatically. How do you make sense of a ritual? How do you interpret a ritual? That's the question that drives me. So here we analyze, well, we've got a separation between the caboclos in the top right and the pretos velhos in the top left, but there's the Virgin Mary up there with the pretos velhos, and a gender division of orixás or inquices or voduns on the bottom. And we can start analyzing the connections between them. And at a certain point, the real question is, what's going on in the ritual? And that's a different story. And when you interview people about these entities, they'll speak of a personal relationship to 1 or 2 of these entities. And to make sense of what's going on, that ritual manifestation of entities is more important than the iconography, which serves sort of a generic framing purpose. There's been a lot of talk about the ontological term. So with Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and others, that's a nice inversion of the idea that European ideas about what exists dominate. The idea that there is one world and a scientific view of the world is true, and all these cultural ideas about different entities and divinities and spirits are interesting anthropological topics, but they don't really have any reality. And then that situation is inverted so that all anthropological theory is itself a shadow of insider mythology and beliefs. But the ontological turn is problematic because it mixes metaphysics and ethnography. If it is really claiming that every different culture, every religious tradition has a different world and that all these different worlds are real, there are all sorts of tough philosophical problems that have not really been worked through, because the gesture towards inverting the colonial epistemology is a valid one, but it doesn't clear up the philosophy. But on the other hand, if we simply say that the ontological turn is just a matter of taking seriously what people say about what they believe in, then that's just ethnography in a post-colonial light, and all the emphasis on ontology is just misleading. So I would say, quickly, forget about ontology. Let's talk about methodology. How do we make sense of what is going on? So here, Afro-Brazilian entity or not? How do we take seriously the ontology of different groups by asking what do their words refer to, and then granting a sense of reality to the reference of those terms. This young girl died of food poisoning at a party in Brazil, decades ago now. And her spirit appears to Catholic benzedeiras, or women who offer blessing. I owe a Barbie doll to Miriam Terezinha if I ever publish my book on Umbanda. But her spirit also appears in rituals of Kardecist spiritism. But her spirit also appears in rituals of Umbanda, which is arguably an Afro-Brazilian tradition, depending on how it's practiced. So is she an Afro-Brazilian spirit or not? More to the point, all of these different traditions have the same referent for their talk. It's this woman, this girl. We know where she's buried. We know when and how she died. We know where her family lives. The referent is perfectly clear. So it doesn't help us understand anything about what's going on. We have to look at the rituals, the context where things are happening. Knowing the referent gets us nowhere. Here's a distinction between two types of artifacts. Now someone's phoning me. It's spam from Ontario again. Two types of artifact. This is not a hard distinction, and it's not the only distinction. But if you're looking at a guia, a necklace which symbolizes a person's relationship to a certain, in this case, Inkisi and Candomblé Angola, people don't talk to this necklace as if it is the entity, as if the entity is present in it. But if you're looking at assentamento or shrine, people do interact with the object as if the entity was present in it, as if you were talking to Eshu when you talk to. You feed Eshu by feeding the assentamento. So there's a ritual interaction which we can only make sense of if we credit a distributed sense of agency, that the action of the entity is linked to the presence of the object. And that's similar to what we have to do when an issue incorporates in Kimbanda, and you're suddenly talking to an issue where a second ago you were talking to a pomba gira, but incorporated in the same body of the medium in front of you. The question is this: how do we make sense of what's going on? And the answer is you have to pick up on the cues in the ritual context that tell you how to interpret how agency, the activity of entities and people, is distributed in that ritual. In the background is philosophy, of course, and we're talking about a disagreement between two views of meaning. This goes deep and it reshapes everything from how you talk to a friend over coffee to how you do ethnographic fieldwork. But clearly, if the idea that we think meaning is referential makes perfect sense as a method. So if you say, pass me the salt, that's not the salt, that's the pepper, I want the other one. All of that is a matter of linking words to objects. And I could say, there's snow outside. We can check that with our senses. So we always use reference, what words refer to come to meaning in empirical cases. That's a method. But that doesn't mean we need to turn that into the basis of a theory for what every word means in every context. Because if you're talking about God or a spirit or the afterlife, heaven, hell, or justice, or polythetic definitions, point to one of those and I'll tell you how much it weighs. The language of representation starts to fall down. So certainly representation is a method, but is it a good theory? For making sense of rituals, especially rituals with entities which are empirical in an unusual sense, you have to read their presence from cues, not actually double check that you can see them, what they look like, what they sound like. It's all indirect. It makes sense to think about meaning as interpretational. So what is meaning? It's just what we end up with when we interpret. So meaning's kind of an empty placeholder for when you understand enough to move on with whatever your plan is in this context. In an ethnographic case, convergence on insider views to the point where you feel like you're not, there's no end, no clear end to the process, but meaning is an open-ended shorthand. So if we take meaning in that sense, we can look back on representational meaning and see some problems. First, that shift from methodology to metaphysics. Do we really need to take our most common way of getting at meaning as the sum total of what meaning is? Seems a bit of a stretch. There are clearly some very complex and nuanced recent philosophical representational theories, but I would argue that they all run afoul of the kind of complex references and presences and agency of entities in Afro-Brazilian religions. Representationalism is arduously colonial in the obvious sense that when Christian colonizers arrived in other countries, they'd said, well, we know that any language to do with God refers to our God, so yours can't refer to anything. You've got nothing to refer to, so your religion is false. Either your religious language is referring to the kind of God that we have, which of course is what God means, or you don't have a God, as happened in Africa and many other places. So the idea that representation is the sum total of meaning distorts the encounter with traditions that have to be read in more pragmatic terms. And it's also a zero-sum game. It leads to the reduction of orishas to Catholic saints because we need a clear referent. And in the colonial context, it's a zero-sum game because if the word God or divinity refers and only means because it refers to one specific thing, then the fight is on. Who has more power to say whether their referent is the right referent? And if my referent is the right referent, then yours is the wrong referent. What's going on here? How do we interpret this? Again, there are references. That's the Virgin Mary there. We can see Iemanjá, the spirits. No, not that meaning of spirits, the other meaning of spirits. But we got no ritual here. There's no one to talk to. This is just sitting beside a road when the evangelicals don't come along and destroy everything. One week it's mainly Afro-Brazilian. The next week is like totally Christian. We got two Virgin Marys here. And then they have evangelicals wipe everything out and it's repopulated. It's hard to interpret. It's hard to say what the referents are. But we can tell, both observing and from the ritual cues, the offerings, that these are requests for assistance, for healing, for help. And the intersection of different belief systems in the ritual, again, privileges the ritual context. It's become popular, like Kevin Shilbrack and others say, don't talk about supernatural, talk about super empirical. But that doesn't really work. Eduardo Porcher points out that how complex the construction and the ritual manifestation of objects are in Afro-Brazilian religions. And that leads us to ask, are entities really super empirical? I would say not at all. When I talk to a caboclo, or when I talk to a preto velho in Umbanda, when I talk to the Pomba Gira and Yeshu manifesting in the same medium in Kimbanda, I know who I'm talking to. There's clearly something empirical there. The cues, the objects, the tone of voice, the body language, the ritual space itself, the knowledge that this is Umbanda, this is Kimbanda, at least today. Yesterday it may have been something else. Those all help me identify the presence of a spirit. That is eminently empirical. But if we have a representational view that we have to have a sensory set of data that correspond, that allow us to double check the referent, we get off track. But if we say we are making sense of a ritual, and in this context, within this ritual frame, within the doctrinal frame, this must be interpreted as the presence of an entity. Why doesn't that count equally as existence? And the answer is because we're too hung up on ontology and metaphysics and not focused enough on semantics and methodology. Two concepts are important then to try to get us to my conclusion, which is definition of divinity, semantic reduction. All communication with anyone is reduced in the sense that you draw meanings from a context. Let me give you an example. Very open, minimally reduced conversations, or you start talking to someone over a coffee. More reduced, you're at a doctor's office. You're not going to just chat with the doctor. There's open your mouth and say, oh, it hurts here. What you say and how it's interpreted is constrained by that context. Watching a play is a constraint. Me giving a class. If students talk to me outside in the class in the hallway, things are more open. They might ask me what's going on in my life. I might or might not answer. Inside the classroom, we're playing roles, and that constrains what is said and how it's to be interpreted. Religious ritual constrains interpretation. So we make sense of what entities are doing. We understand their existence because the cues tell us what's on track and what's not on track. This has a lot to do with views of learning, like that Tanya Luhrmann and Arno Aloy point to, that, it takes a year or so to learn how to do the thing they do in this place, whether it's talking to God or incorporating saints in candomblé. What are people learning? They're learning embodied behavior by mirroring themselves in others. Again, Eduardo Porcher's recent book on the Afro-Brazilian religions in the context of the philosophy of religion underlines this point. You converge on interpretation, you begin to feel it. In that sense, becoming a member of a tradition and being an ethnographer are very similar. You're learning to read the room where that room contains all sorts of cues. So when we have something like this, questions of entities get us nowhere. These are a type of religious procession, very common in Brazil, many types of religious procession. How are you going to make sense of it? It makes no sense at all to start talking about who these people are dressed as in terms of what exists, what doesn't exist. You have to put it in a network of semantic associations. To give a quick sense, this more traditional festival is arguably racist because there are three groups: the white, the African, the indigenous, and they all parade in different costumes. That's from 100 years ago, the myth of racial harmony in Brazil. It's an ideological racism denying myth, but it's instantiated in this tradition. The people in the tradition would say, these are just our traditions. We've been doing this for many decades. If you go to look at the Congado and other rituals in, say, Belo Horizonte, they're much more shaped by anti-racist, anti-ideological discourse. The tradition has been trained to fit a certain political ideology. Regardless of what one thinks about the ideology, it's less traditional. And there's a saint in the middle. The referent of the saint remains the same, but the meaning of the saint has shifted because of that shift in semantic context. The other idea is interpretive convergence. That's just the idea where you need to start seeing things the way that insiders see things. So there's no sharp line between insider and outsider. That's another manifestation of the wrong sort of semantic approach. From an interpretive approach, insiders and outsiders are doing the same thing. It's just insiders have a head start on learning all the cues. Here's a good example. Renato in this multi-religious terreiro with Quimbanda, Candomblé Angola, and Umbanda. Was paid by a client because her husband left her. And so the Pombagira was paid. He took the money for her to do this service, and he didn't come back. So the client came and complained, saying, I paid you good money for your Pombagira to go and get this guy back. So Pai Renato lectured the Pombagira here. He lectured this physical set of objects that she had not performed the required service. And he put a very heavy hammer down right beside this assentamento and said, if you don't get your act together, you're out of here. The husband came back. So how do we interpret that? We can only interpret that by seeing agency as distributed in a different way, and in a way that escapes a sort of closure of interpretation, precisely because the entity is not in our control. We can't pin the entity down. We can negotiate with it, talk with it, feed it, interact with it, but the entities escape semantic closure. Let's look at the idea of supernatural then in this context. We could say that what supernatural means, and that we could generalize to all religions from this basis of Afro-Brazilian religions, but let's keep it in this context, is attributing agency elsewhere. Now, I think that one of the key points that we have to make sense of is when the medium is there, the entity is not there, and when the medium is gone, the entity is there. There is something of a zero-sum game. I go out for beer with my brother-in-law's brother is an Umbandist medium, and when I'm having a beer with him, I'm having a beer with the medium. If I run into him on the way to the terreiro where he works, Centro now, he switched places, I know it's my brother-in-law's brother dressed in white on the way to do his task because he's outside, different context. But when I see him in the ritual, I'm not sure. Is he Cambone today? So he's not incorporating? Or do I say now he's incorporating? Now it's not my brother-in-law's brother anymore. That zero-sum game marks the most crucial moment in Afro-Brazilian traditions where agency is present. That naturalizes the rest of the extensions of agency. Notice the key point then. Supernatural is not a physical issue. It's a methodological issue. It manifests itself in the way that agency is redistributed in certain ritual contexts. So these are people posing for a photograph. And when I went to Korea and interviewed a Mudang there, she made it clear she wasn't actually incorporating. She was just pretending to incorporate. Once again, the ritual context allows us to make sense of when it's an entity or when it's a medium. So here's a definition of divinity. And the key point here is talking to people doesn't get you far enough. There's a supplement, there's a beyond, there's an excess. If you simply read the room as a bunch of people standing around doing stuff, you can't make sense of it. That's not a productive hypothesis. You must have an additional hypothesis that there is some other agent in the room. It's not that do people fake? I asked an Umbanda medium once, do people fake their possession, their incorporation? He said, definitely. And he told me this story, which gave me exactly the opposite of what I was expecting. Well, I know a guy, he's an Umbandist, and he totally can't remember what happens when the entity comes. And I'm thinking, well, in Candomblé, complete trance amnesia is more common. In Umbanda, it's semi-trance. In Kardecism, non-trance. And so he didn't have the right level of trance for that particular tradition. But it wasn't that he was faking incorporation. That was he wasn't converging on the norm that is required for making sense and acting within that context. So divinity then is simply a gap in a certain mode of explanation that requires us to lean on the insider discourse to have anything apart from a question mark. But there's more. The medium doesn't even know what's going on with the entity in many ways. And that supplements the idea of divinity in an interesting way, that one of the reasons why we can say there's something supernatural in a different sense going on with Afro-Brazilian religions is precisely the fact that you can never nail down a complete interpretation of this agent who, when you read the ritual, there's someone else acting here. That is not my brother-in-law's brother's voice, posture. This is a different conversation. And yet, there's always more. If I ask entities about themselves, I can get a bit of biography. I get a sense of depth. There's a depth, but I can never capture all that depth. But there's nowhere in the room to look for that depth. It's not the medium's depth. It's not the Pai de Santos depth. There is always a supplement, an excess of meaning. Is it real meaning? No, it's a meaning that the ritual context itself perhaps constructs, but that is, for lack of a better word, divinity. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Stephen, for your fascinating talk. And with that, we have over 30 minutes for Q&A. Hopefully, there will be a few people wanting to talk to us. Evan Fales had already raised his hand, so I'll give the floor to him for him to ask his questions. If you want, Evan, you can ask a question to each of them, or you can ask one general question and we can see who's up for responding. Feel free to do however you like.
Okay. I think there were some chat questions perhaps that preceded me.
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. No. Okay. Well, I'm always somebody who's got questions about everything. I do want to address this to all three of the members in a way, and especially to Ofuasia, or more particularly to him. Just a little bit of background. So I'm a philosopher. I do a lot of metaphysics, and my second love is anthropology. And I found that the two converge when it comes to providing an ontology for social realities, which I take to be non-natural because they're conventional. So they are actually supernatural. This insight and some fundamental insights from quite a number of anthropologists and ethnographies have, I think, really provided me with what I think is an interesting tool for interpretation. I take interpretation to mean exactly discerning what the author of a text meant. Okay, so I could go on and on about the ontology of social entities. That would be a whole long story, which I'm not going to go into here, other than to say that what I can make perfectly good sense of shrines that are inhabited by some kind of a deity or spirit or something like that. No problem there. And I don't distinguish really between meaning and reference. I don't think that's in fact necessary. All right. Let me turn to a rather particular point that Ofuasia made, which is that a fundamental distinction between the Abrahamic traditions and these other traditions is that the Western traditions are monotheistic, and they attribute to God all sorts of perfections. I've spent most of my life studying the Bible in anthropological terms. And I do want to point out that there's general scholarly agreement now that the first sentence of the Bible, which is traditionally interpreted as God created the heavens and the earth. Is agreed by most scholars not to be the right interpretation. There's confusion there because Hebrew doesn't have vowels. The correct reading seems to be when God was creating the earth and the heavens. And the thing he created them out of is the chaos waters. This is borrowed directly from environment, ancient Near Eastern traditions, Sumerian, Babylonian, and so on. It is also the case that if you look at the Old Testament carefully, you will find that, first of all, the ancient Jews were henotheists. They believed there were lots of gods. Secondly, their God, Yahweh, or El, as he was originally known, makes errors. He makes bad decisions and then later has regrets. He has, actually, it's hard to find in the Bible passages that attribute to him omniscience, omnibenevolence, and so on. So I want to suggest that at least in its origins as Abrahamic religions, it's hard to make a clear distinction in my mind between what goes on in some or many non-Abrahamic religions and the early Abrahamic ones. And I'm curious what responses people might have.
Okay, so I'll give the floor to Emmanuel, and then if Bettina or Stephen want to piggyback on that, they can. So Emmanuel.
All right. Thank you very much for your question. Because there are other hands, I want to be very brief. Yes, I completely agree with you concerning the intersection between philosophy and anthropology. And that's why towards the end of my book on panentheism, I insisted on ethnographic studies of ritual archives of African spirituality, which is one thing that the discipline is lacking. And I argued vigorously for this as an approach that African philosophers of religion should entertain in their research. Concerning the distinction on monotheism as something that is usually ascribed to the Judeo-Christian tradition, I completely agree with you that there are elements in the Bible that suggest that God is not as powerful as portrayed. God regrets creating humans. God affirms that God is responsible for good and evil in that same Bible. But this is the injection of how we want to talk about God into the dominant and mainstream version of God. So I think a careful assessment of the Bible too shows that there are ways you can interpret panentheism even in Christian doctrine. So I think I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Do Bettina or Stephen want to respond to that, or should we go on to? So we'll go on to the next question is by Rotimi Omosulu. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks. My question is to Emmanuel Ofuasia. I enjoyed your presentation and that of others. But if African religious worldview is monotheistic, as you wanted us to believe, how could we situate that worldview within slavery that took place in Africa? Then I want to ask the organizer a question. I look at the arrangement of the presentation. Which logic was used to arrange the hierarchy of presentation? I want to know that. Thank you.
I'm sorry, which logic was used to do what?
To arrange the presentation, was it according to importance or equality?
Uh, I don't know if I understand the question. So th this is basically a panel of people interested in African and Afro-diasporic religions from a philosophical perspective. Emmanuel is a philosopher, Stephen is a philosopher and an anthropologist, a student of religions, and Bettina is an anthropologist. So that's what I can say about the idea here. And the order is not very important. Bettina asked me that she not be the first one to speak. Then I just bumped Emmanuel to do that first. But that came out nicely because he is talking about African religion, and then Bettina and Stephen are talking about Afro-diasporic religions. So that's that. So I'll give the floor to Emmanuel, and thank you, Rotimi, for your questions.
Thank you very much, Jose. And Dr. Rotimi, thank you very much for your question. Without wasting much time, I think I'll agree with Jose concerning the arrangement of the talks today, because this is very very important to understand the question you raised concerning the connection between slavery and panentheism. The unfortunate and gloomy history of the transatlantic slave trade is responsible for a thriving culture of religions and spiritualities across the continents. Most of the Africans taken away as slaves. Remember, on the coast, the West African coast, we have the Gold Coast, we have the Ivory Coast, but the region from Badagry down to Calabar is designated as a slave coast. And so these areas are where most of the slaves were carted away to Europe and to the Americas. And so most of these carried the religious practices over there. And this is evident in the presentation offered by Bettina and Stephen, because they made a lot of statements, a lot of excerpts that reflect the connection between the Americas and how they practice African spirituality, and how in the homeland we practice it as well. So personally, I think it is worth considering panentheism in Afro-Brazilian religions, although my good friend Jose takes the position that talking about the concept of divinity in Afro-Brazilian religions is what he calls hierarchical polytheism. And I think I have responded to that through an objection in my book. So I think I will respond to Dr. Rotimi like that. Thank you very much for your question, sir.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So now we have Ricardo Silvestre, who's joining us. Please, Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, thanks Bettina, Stephen, and Emmanuel for the insightful presentations. Thank you also, Porcher, for sharing this wonderful session. Well, I have a question for Stephen. And well, your talk, Stephen, was wonderful. I think that many of the issues you brought, they are important also for other traditions as well. But I'm a bit concerned about these two views of meaning slides of yours. And so I'm gonna say some brief words, and then I will ask my question. So you distinguish between those two views, representational and interpretational. Perhaps instead of representational, referential would be better. You use the word reference in its description. But my point is the following. You say that the interpretational view, that meaning is not fixed, but depends on context, depend on the person who's uttering whatever, and also his or her actions. My question is, because it seems to me that this interpretational view is also, in some sense, referential, because once you fix the context, once you fix all the mental states of the speaker who are somehow relevant for the meaning of the word, and perhaps the goals that the person has, I mean, within a ritual, for instance. It seems to me that words will still refer to something. And something that might be a second question, I don't know. I was a bit puzzled about your definition of divinity. You have on the slide, and you say that I saved it here. An Afro-Brazilian divinity is a semantic node. This is a second question. I would like you to clarify what you mean by a semantic node, and later on you said that becomes operative when within a semantically context. So I mean, does that mean that an entity or a divinity somehow is language dependent? I was a bit confused by that. Anyway.
Thank you, Ricardo, for your questions. Stephen, please. Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
Pardon me. Yeah, the philosophical background is Davidsonian semantic holism. So Donald Davidson can stand in for my responses there. It's a well-established debate. I would point to three things. First, the language is not referential in the sense that reference grounds the theory of meaning, but obviously words refer. As I said before, methodologically, reference is the basic way we learn things. But what I'm saying is, second point, in the ritual context, what do the words refer to? We can't postulate an entity. That would be, the only justification for that would be a theory of meaning that hooked words to the world. With an interpretational view of meaning, we're doing the more methodologically grounded thing of simply saying the words can only have meaning in this context. So what is it in this context that I have to associate these words? And that's what node is, that the meaning is always networked to a bunch of other ideas. In addition, one interprets action and words in exactly the same way from this perspective, which is another big advantage for the study of religion. Third point, if you pay attention to the literature in religious studies, my discipline specifically, over the last 30, 40 years, the only game on the table is Davidsonian semantic theory. It has been found to be very powerful, very useful. There's a lot of literature on the table, people working with that particular semantic view. And there are people who simply don't get into the semantics and continue with a naive referential view. If you want to keep representationism, which is the currently accepted word in this particular discourse, but you could name it a bunch of other things, you have to look to much more complex views of representational theory. I still think they're going to run afoul of some of the examples I gave. I mean, how do you make sense of the referent, and it gets complicated. But the basic view, that the sort of everyday view that words just mean by pointing to things in the world, that's a non-starter in philosophical terms. So you have to go deep into semantic theory. I mean, Kripke is off the table now. We're past that. And there's a lot of semantic theory on the table, but you don't need to go there. And I didn't see a need to go into it. There was no time to go into it. The bottom line is, if you start with my question, how do I interpret this ritual? Talk about entities existing or not is useless. So it's a methodological point, and that will get us as far as we need for this discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Before we move on to the other two people that raised their hand, I will read a question from the chat because it's directed at Bettina, and she hasn't had any questions so far. So Emmanuel, our guest, asks Bettina two things. First, can you elaborate on the role that blood sacrifice plays in recharging or increasing the intensity of Ashe? And two, are there taboos or moral transgressions that may diminish Ashe? I ask these questions to understand how the concept, as you have discussed it, approximates how it is conceived in the homeland. Thanks. So please unmute. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bettina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for these questions. And if you want, I can send you a paper about animal sacrifice in Brazil mainly and in North America. It's and so blood sacrifice. Of course, sacrifice is not just blood sacrifice. Sacrifice are also very different forms of sacrifices. And so wearing a certain color, not eating a certain food is also a sacrifice, or not doing things or doing things are also considered sacrifice. Blood sacrifice is seen as the most the value one, but it's usually blood giving to the orishas or to the spirits, and so it's not and so blood of an animal, and so chicken or a goat, and giving drops into the ground will reach the orishas, and this is seen as one gives blood to the orisha in order to regain ashe, and so it's not that the human are drinking the blood, but the energy is given to the orisha in order to get energy back. You also ask diminish ashe. This is also very, very important, and so ashe can not only be won, but it can also be lost. By, for instance, when somebody goes through initiation and therefore makes promises to do certain rituals in throughout the life of the person, and then after a few years they forget about it. This means that they are not fulfilling the obligations, and therefore will lose ashe. And so it's all about really maintaining a good relationship with the orishas in order to maintain a level of ashe. Throughout life, one sometimes gets lower, and then one can get illnesses, and sometimes one gets too high, which is also not good. And so I hope I answered your question, but it is a very wide topics you mentioned, you asked for. Oh, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Bettina. So we have two people with our hands raised. First is Arabia Atoe. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have two questions, one for Emmanuel and one for Bettina. Bettina's question is a very simple clarificatory question, but I'll start with Emmanuel. So his view that the idea of God in African philosophy is panentheistic might encounter a problem, and that problem would depend on how the existence of that problem will depend on how Emmanuel answers my question. So I wonder about the status of entities from which God creates ex materia, as Emmanuel notes. My problem is, are these fundamental raw materials different from or the same thing as God? And if it's separate from God, what does that mean for your panentheism? Because it would imply that there is no panentheism. Or the idea of God is not panentheistic in African philosophy or religion. But if it's the same thing as God, then does God really create ex materia, as you claim? And perhaps the same follows the idea that God emerges from some sort of entity or some sort of primordial soup. So is this primordial thing the same thing as God? And if not, what really is God? Is it the primordial thing from which God is created from or emerges from? Or is it the thing that effectively creates God that is God? And what does all this mean for your panentheism, which you declare? And then for Bettina, you mentioned, so in vitalist literature, the idea is always to increase your vitality as much as possible. But you note that, at least for Afro-Brazilian traditions, having too high of of Ashe might be problematic for the individual. I'm just curious as to what sorts of problems might emerge from having too much vitality or having too much Ashe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Arabia. So I'll first give the word to Emmanuel and then Bettina.
All right, Arabia, thank you for your question. I will commence briefly by returning to Martin Heidegger, who, after making a survey of the history of metaphysics, concluded that the history of metaphysics has confused the guiding question with the grounding question. And one of the implications is that metaphysics has become ontological, because where attempts has been made to answer the question of God, of being, the ground that sustains everything, including God, God has been substituted with being. So, similarly, when I tender that in African spirituality, God emerged from primeval substances, like, for instance, the ancient Kemites of Egypt, they announced that the primordial ground that sustains all things, including God, is Nun, N-U-N. So, Nun is being. And being is not God, as Heidegger makes us to understand. Being, the capital B, E-I-N-G, is that primordial ground that sustains everything, including God. And Heidegger establishes that efforts to even use human words to capture these concepts can lead to some misconceptions, and that is why most of his works are actually on being are actually misunderstood. And so it is based on this reasoning that I'm arguing that most of the items that arise from the pre-existing materials that were used were established by being. However, the life force that articulates itself in these entities are sustained by God. And in Yoruba tradition, we talk about the life force called Emi. And in an Ifa tradition, it is said that when it is time for somebody to die, it is only the works of one's hand that can save one. For when Olodumare comes, it comes to take or retrieve the Emi, the life force, from you. And so practically, when somebody is dead, we say the person has passed out. The person can no longer breathe. So technically, we are breathing God. To bring this to a nutshell, I would also be very cautious, because I try to take oral tradition, I try to interpret, I try to make views, even though they may not be acceptable to me, but I try as much as possible to see that this is what these people believe, and if it can operate and work for them, who am I to question how much they are able to use it to make sense of their life? So these are ideas I try to defend. I can question them, but this works for them, and they are documented in the oral tradition. So if they believe that is the case for them, who am I to knock it off? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Bettina?
I must admit, Arabia, I didn't understand all of your question. Could you repeat it for me?
Yes, sorry, Bettina. I was saying, you said that in the Afro-Brazilian tradition, having too much Ashe can be problematic for the individual. So I'm just curious as to what sorts of problems might emerge for the individual if he or she has too much Ashe.
Okay. Thank you. And so Ashe is the energy which makes everything living and creative and vibrant, and it's often perceived as it's also similar medium temperature. And so, like, when you get too much sun, sun is usually seen as good, vitamin D and so on. But if you get too much, you will become ill. And similar is with the energy, the divine energy. If it's too much, can potentially create a problem or an illness. And so really think about this, getting too much sunshine is also sometimes not good, but not getting enough, which we have here in Wales, as it is raining for weeks, it's also not good. I hope this metaphor explains what I mean by the right balance.
Thanks very much, Bettina. I'm sorry about the weather in Wales. And we have one last person raising their hand. Oguntola Laguda, please, sir. Feel free to ask your questions. You are muted right now.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I've really had fun listening to philosophers, anthropologists, and also ethnographers from one perspective to the other. But then my direct observation and question will go to Emmanuel. Sincerely speaking, he has done what I can call a novelty. And also, I'm proposing panentheism for the concept of God in Africa, and also those who are critique of his work, who also have also come up with panentheism, did not do what he did in terms of gathering materials or gathering data for his work, and then using oral traditions that led to his conclusion. I also like the historicity, of course, of his presentation in his recent book, where, he relied on the work of the colonial scholars, the post-colonial scholars, and then comes to the modern time and also reaches his conclusion. But I have a challenge, and the challenge is that there's something missing. I've been reading the book as if I have an exam to write. There's something in the cis culture in Africa that he has used. I think in this presentation, he mentioned Olodumare, which is a Yoruba religion or Yoruba spirituality, just to agree with his submission, that he was talking about Ifa, using, I think, whether it's Uturameji or Iwurimeji, to come up with it, and I understand that very well. But then I always have a challenge when you use only Ifa. Of course, I believe is the greatest source for Yoruba spirituality. But then there's always conflict in terms of interpretation or the poem that those who are the custodian of Ifa will give to you in terms of the same Odu. And then you start to wonder if they are consistent or not. So as a scholar, we often face the challenge of which one are we going to use? Do we just use the one that is supporting our position, or use the one that is not totally supporting our position and raises question going further on the subject matter? That is number one. The second issue, which I think is missing in the whole issue of panentheism, is the fact of subjectivity and relativity. Because this is something that I think should have been built into the whole idea. Because the Shona, for example, in Zimbabwe, may not have the same, even though they have an idea, and it's very clear that they would prefer panentheism to monotheism that was imposed on us. But then the fact is, this is not the same context. It is not the same situation and scenario like that of the Yorubas that you want to talk about in Nigeria, and also Yoruba-derived religion in the Yoruba diaspora. So I want to think that it's very, Emmanuel going forward should start thinking about the issue of relativism and the issue of subjectivity in trying to come to a defense, because there's going to be many critique of his work, and I'm sure he's ready because I know him very well. But at the same time, I think he will be getting ready for that particular pushback, which he needs to address. I really had fun. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for your question. We have 3 minutes left until what is 2 p.m. for me and whatever for you. I know Stephen is still there's it's still morning in Canada, and it must be almost 6 p.m. for Emmanuel. So we have to keep to the schedule. So I'm sorry, Evan, you'll not be able to ask more questions, but you can ask them directly via email, of course. Everyone here is very collegial. And Emmanuel, you have 2, 3 minutes to answer. Please.
All right. Thank you, Jose, for your generosity. I will be very, very economic with my time. I completely agree with Professor Lagoda. And by the way, Professor Lagoda is a former teacher who taught me since I was a freshman in 2008 at Lagos State University. I'm happy that he has followed my progress up till now, and I'm sure that he'll be very proud of himself. I agree completely with him about the theme of interpretation. For instance, there is a particular Odwifa that says, Bonitiri ọ̀la ò rí bẹ́ẹ̀, ló dífá fún babaláwo tó ń dífá ojoojúmọ́, according to some people. Another version says, ló dífá fún babaláwo tó ń dífá ọ̀rọ̀ọ̀rọ̀. Now, one version says that because today is not as it was yesterday, this is the reason why the Ifa diviner cast divination. Some say every day. Another interpretation says every 5 days. So what do we do? How do we arrange and come to conclusion? I raised this point when I was at a conference with the renowned Awisha Agbaye of Ifa, that is Professor Wande Abimbola, and they affirmed that the correct is that divination is performed in that verse every 5 days. And then I also understand the fact that I cannot apply Ifa context in the Yoruba spirituality to the issues in the Shona. And one of the things I try to point out in my book is to raise the consciousness. I am not saying that panentheism is one size fits all for all of these religious cultures. I'm saying that we should break the spell of monotheism. The impact of the Abrahamic monotheisms in making sense of African spirituality should be eliminated. And then each scholar, each individual that is a specialist in these Afro-religious cultures can then take it further. And that is why I was proposing a third wave proposal in my book, so that we can see if panentheism fits or it doesn't fit. I'm just asking for evidence. I have brought the strengths that I have and the cultures that I'm familiar with. I enjoin others to please do the same for the cultures that you are familiar with. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Emmanuel, for your answers. And well, thanks everyone who came in, especially our guests, Emmanuel, Bettina, and Stephen. Thanks for your wonderful talks. I wish we had more time to talk, but I think we could. We were successful in getting the ball rolling on these issues, some of which are very, very new to most of the people, I guess, who are here. And feel free to get in touch with me or with our guests. We are all very willing to engage with your further questions. Thanks so much for everyone who came in, and I guess we'll talk soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, José, for organizing it. Wonderful.
Thank you, Bettina, for coming and agreeing to be with us. It was wonderful seeing you again, Bettina, Emmanuel, Stephen, and everyone who came and talked to us.